Hello and welcome back to the 8th episode of How to Play Paragon. Today we're going to be looking at the offlane and basically looking at how you should be playing in the offlane, what you should be looking for, and things to think about while in the offlane. And as for any lane, you should be thinking about the hero and deck that you're going to be playing with when you get to play the offlane. Although when you want to play offline, you should be thinking very heavily about what hero you want to play. You should know that hero in and out, you should know their strengths, weaknesses, how to play them, as well as have a strong knowledge of how well they scale. Every type of hero scales differently, so you need to know what kind of cards work well with what kind of hero. You then want to be able to maximize your output for whatever kind of output you wanted to get, whether you want it to be more tanky or whether you want to be more damaging. If it sounds a bit confusing or you're new to this, I would highly recommend copying someone else's build. I will cover this in later tutorials, but it's a bit advanced for now. The one thing you have going for you as a solo player in the offlane versus two people is you will easily out-level the enemy players. This will not only create opportunities to outplay them because you'll have more skills available in the early game, it will also allow you to do more damage, which will allow you to poke the enemy carry, either forcing them back earlier than what they intended to do, or making them play a lot more safe than they originally were. However, you must beware a pre-made safe lane on the enemy team, especially if they have voice communications going, because this will mean they'll be working a lot better together than they would if they were just using text chat. A quick tip for deck building for offlane is you want to make sure you have a lot of cheap cards with a lot of little bonuses when you complete them. This gives you the most optimal deck possible for your games. Getting a lot of cheap cards with bonuses will allow you to make the most of what you've got. And hopefully this will allow you to either win the lane, hold the lane and make sure your tower's not destroyed, or just wait for the jungler to come in. Now I'm going to be talking about farming in the offlane. The enemy or enemies you get in the offlane can be very random at times because it's not completely set in stone what the meta is at the minute. Though if we take this example, we've got a support and a carry. Right now I'm farming to the best of my abilities, trying to get the farm that I can go for and trying to make sure that if I do go for it, I'm not getting punished too hard for it. And really that's the main role of the offlane farming game. You want to make sure that you're getting as much as possible, taking as little damage as possible, while at the same time making it so that they have to focus on you, so they're really working to try and make you not able to get this farm. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's easy to outlevel your opponent if there's two of them in the lane. They'll be soaking up half the XP that you will, so you'll be leveling up twice as fast as they will. Once you're level 4 or 5, depending on what kind of hero you're playing, you might be able to start trying to snowball the lane. And what snowballing is it's the act of getting a kill that allows you to get more subsequent kills due to the power spike you'll be getting from the card points. Though I would only try this if you know you're probably going to get a kill or at least force the enemy to back, allowing you to get a card point and XP advantage. And I do accept that this is only possible if the enemy isn't being very aggressive. If it turns out that your lane opponent or your lane opponents are very good and you're not too sure if you can win the lane, just try and hold your own and make sure the tower stays alive. Eventually your team should rotate around to try and help you. And now we're going to be moving on to where to ward. You should always be warding, especially if you think that the jungler might come early. Early game is really your weakest point as an offlaner. You can either ward here to make sure you catch them through the river or through your jungle. You can also hide it in the trees, which is kind of cool. You can put it there. And another place that you might think about warding is actually up in the raptors. When the raptors start spawning, you definitely want to make sure the enemy jungler or team is definitely not getting that. And you can also ward here to make sure that they're not going to come from in front of you. That's pretty much the basics of warding for the offlane. We're now going to be thinking about opportune times to roam. And honestly, roaming in the offlane is a very rare thing indeed. It's very rare that you're going to get the opportunity to roam, because if there's two people in your lane, which is most likely going to be most of the time, there's a very high chance that the wave is going to be pushing towards your tower. However, if you take a situation like this where I've already taken the lane and both laners are actually in the lane, once I've pushed this back a considerable amount to give me a little bit of free time to go, I could possibly go to mid lane, try and help him get the enemy laner to back, and then try help take his tower. Either that or I could come back to defend my tower. However, be very careful when thinking of roaming from the offlane if your tower is still alive. Once you leave the lane, if your enemy's smart or if they've got wards, they will know that they can take full advantage of that, take your tower before you get back. And even if you got back while they were taking the tower, the likelihood of you being able to stop them from taking it would be very low unless you were very far ahead or brought help with you. I know that's not a very helpful guide of when to roam in the offlane, but it's a very situational lane to play in. It can depend a lot on the circumstances that you've encountered during that game and that specific game alone. Now hopefully something I can help you more with is your role in team fights. It depends heavily on what kind of hero you've picked and what kind of deck you've got. For example, if I was playing Kwang like I am now, I would be very much the DPS role that I would be in team fights anyway. However, if you wanted to play someone like Feng Mao, play him a bit more tanky, You'd be able to be more of a bruiser, but still doing a considerable amount of damage in team fights. Or I've even seen people taking a second carry and putting it in their left lane, such as Murdoch or maybe even Twin Blast. As I said in the beginning of the video though, you must know this character in and out, their strengths, weaknesses, how to play them, and the way that you want to play them in this particular role. I would advise, however, if you are going to play someone squishy in the offlane, pay attention to the draft quite heavily, because if they have quite a strong lane, such as a support and a carry that has quite a bit of CC and damage in it, you might not want to play someone squishy, as it'll allow you to be an open target unless you're planning to get a lot of support from your team. Your pick for offlane should be a mix of what you would like to play and what your team needs. That will ultimately give you the most satisfaction out of the game and at the same time be the most useful for you and your team. And now for my final thoughts on the offlane. It's a very mixed bag of what you're going to be getting at the minute. Nobody really knows, especially if they're not pre-made, what you're going to be getting on the enemy team. As you can see here, we've got a Kallari as a support. Not really sure why. I mean, it kind of works to a point, but late game it's not really going to do anything for your team. And just to summarise what we've been talking about in the video, your hero and deck will be different almost every game in the offlane. It should be dependent on what your team needs and what you think will be fun to play in this game. Your deck should involve quite a few cheap cards in the early game due to being pressured by 2 people most of the time. This will allow you to maximise your output and make sure you have a few cards stacked up. When farming, you shouldn't be greedy. You'll be punished for it most likely if the enemy is competent. You should, however, poke the enemy carry when he comes forward if you have the mana available to spare. And on top of this, you should always punish mistakes. Always make sure you have some wards available and ready. You never know when an enemy jungler might wander through and try to get a gank, and 1v3 is never fun. Roaming in the offlane is a rare thing. If you didn't manage to do it, it's not your fault. Just try and make sure your tower stays alive and try and farm as much as possible and you've pretty much done your job. If you're able to capitalise on any enemy mistakes, then even better. And as we just discussed, your role in teamfights is very dependent on what you've picked and dependent on what goes on in the draft. And that is pretty much it for the basics of the offlane. If you like this video, give it a like. If you disliked it, give it a dislike. And if you really like me, you can always give me a subscribe. Hope to see you here for the next tutorial.